So we looked and we took an in-depth look at what it looks like for the Hebrew people to come out of exile as they were swept away into Babylon. And while they were there in Babylon under captivity, we know that they were conquered by another empire, the Medes and the Persians, which will soon enough just become the Persian Empire. And as soon as the first Persian king began to reign, he sent out the edict that all the small minorities, all the ethnic minorities under the empire rule that were indentured in servitude of the Persian Empire, he wanted to send them all home, go back to their capital cities, rebuild their temples, and spend time in their temple praying to their own God for the prosperity of the empire of Persia. It was a tactful, it was an ingenious idea for a man who wasn't monotheistic as we of the Christian faith are. He believed that all gods had some merit and some value, and he wanted to make sure he kind of ticked all his boxes, his ducks were in a row, and he was able to send all these small groups back out of the empire to build their temples and basically pray that Persia would be strong and conquer and would be prosperous for a long time. That was Cyrus the First. Cyrus the First sent home the first exiles under Zerubbabel, and we've spent so much time looking at that. But tonight we're coming away from Jerusalem. We're not looking at Jerusalem tonight. We're going back to the empire. We've spent a lot of time in Jerusalem. We're going to go back there when we look at Ezra and Nehemiah in the next couple of weeks. But now we're going back to Persia, because the reality is not all the Hebrews living in Persia returned with the first wave of returning exiles. In fact, only 50,000 or about 48,000 actually went back. The majority stayed in Persia. The majority had built homes and businesses and were even a little bit successful, let's say. And for a long time under Persian rule, they were given pretty much freedom to follow their laws and their rules and practice their religion and their faith under the rule of the Persian Empire. What God is going to do here in the book of Esther is going to be every bit the dislodging of the majority of these Hebrew people as they start to rethink their plan to stay in Persia. We're going to find out in the book of Esther just how quickly and easily it is in a moment for a minority, an ethnic minority under the Persian rule to come under the threat of absolute extermination. And God will use this experience to establish a feast for Israel, the Feast of Purim, but also to encourage them to pack up their bags and get home to where they belong, the city of David, the city of Jerusalem, as God has given his peace upon that place. Why don't you open your Bible to the book of Esther and let's take a look at some opening remarks here. When we turn to the book of Esther, we're around about, and those who love dates and love history, this is meaningful, and the rest of you, this is just going to flitter away into nothingness, but we're looking at around about 480 AD. Now, the first wave of exiles returned about 538, so it's quite a significant period after the first exiles returned, about 50 years thereabouts. And we're going to be introduced to two characters. One's name is Hadassah. She's a young girl, a virgin, and she has a cousin, and his name is Mordecai. And Mordecai is about 15 years older than Hadassah, and Hadassah's parents have died when she was quite young, and she was actually adopted by her cousin, 15 years elder, and he raised her and groomed her and educated her and did a splendid job in raising her in the ways of the Jewish faith and the Jewish ideals. When we open up at Esther 1, we're at about 480 AD. The Greeks and the Persians have only just engaged in an incredibly large war. In fact, historic documents say that the Persian army that went down to fight the Athenians was around about 1 million soldiers. More modern estimates assume that it was probably a little less than that, but no doubt the Persian Empire, at the height of its reign, ruled 50 million people. And if that doesn't have any value to you, the opening remarks of Esther will tell you that the king we will meet in Esther chapter 1, the Hebrews called him Ahasuerus, but his name is Xerxes. We know I'll call him Xerxes for the purposes of tonight, except when I'm reading the text. He will rule from Ethiopia all the way to India. You've got your geography map ready to pull up in the screen of your mind. You can picture modern-day Libya all the way down to modern-day Pakistan. 50 million people, dozens, maybe even hundreds of small ethno-linguistic people groups and nations and populations. The Persian Empire ruled it all, but it was waning. Couldn't defeat the Greeks. Whatever they tried to do, they couldn't defeat the Greeks. And soon enough, not long after this event, about a century or more, there will come a conqueror whose name is Alexander the Great, and he will not only destroy Persia entirely, but he will occupy the entire land as his own empire. We know that as the Greek Empire. Take a look at chapter 1 of Esther. Now, in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces, in those days when the king sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants. The army of the Persians and the Medes and the nobles and the governors of the provinces were before him, while he showed his riches of his royal glory and the splendor and the pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days. And when these days were completed, the king gave all the people who were present in Susa, the citadel, both great and small, a feast lasting 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. Okay, what's going on right now? A feast is occurring, and the king's got all of his nobles, his princes, his military commanders, and they're all there in the capital, Susa. It's about 160 miles north of the Persian Gulf as we know it today in Iran. And he's there with his nobles, his rulers, his governors, all the people that matter. And he's showing off all his wealth and his glory. And at the end of the feast, he does something amazing. He has a 7-day feast. So this guy is clearly showboating everything that he thinks that he has earned and by right is his, and he is bragging because the reality is he knows the foundation of his empire is being slowly dug away by the Greeks. This is real showmanship of the king Xerxes. He's really boasting in this instance of trying to maintain some credibility and some respect in his empire. Let me paraphrase where the story goes from here. After everyone had drank a lot, one of those parties where things don't always end well, and we are told that his queen Vashti actually held her own feast for all of the women. So there's no women where the men are feasting, and there's no men where the women are feasting. And then the king Xerxes says he sends a delegation to grab his wife and bring her in because he showed off his gold, he showed off his palace, he showed off his wealth, his power, he showed off everything except his wife. So he sends for her. He sends her, bring her in, and she's going to come in, and maybe some scholars have said maybe she was going to do a Persian dance or demonstrate, but what the text tells us is that King Xerxes just really wanted to show her off. He wanted all the nobles and the generals and the people that matter, he wanted them to see the beauty of the queen. And she says no. So that's the first time in the book of Esther where you think to yourself, this is amazing. She said no. She said no, and everyone freaks out because remember, everyone that matters is at the banquet. And now everyone that matters has seen that, well, Xerxes might be wealthy, he might be powerful, he might have a lot of prominent friends, but what he doesn't rule is his own household. So they start to murmur, they start to say something. One of the nobles actually says to the king, what is this going to mean for all the other husbands in the land when their wives are going to say, well, Vashti doesn't listen to Xerxes, I ain't going to listen to you. So the king of Persia sends out an edict. You have to remember, this is an incredibly strongly male-dominated society. In fact, let me be stronger, it's chauvinistic. And the men were afraid they were going to lose their place. What would happen if women started saying no? What would become of the world? So the Persian king writes an edict in his own hand and signs with his signet, as we've learned already, that in Persian law, once a law is established with the signet of the king, it can never be undone. We saw that in Daniel. You remember the Persian king in Daniel actually enacted the decree that should anyone be found praying, they'll be thrown into the lion's den. But Daniel and the king were great friends. But Daniel was found to be praying. We remember Daniel. He didn't even try and hide it. He opened up his door, sat on his balcony, and started praying for the whole city to see. I dare you to arrest me, he said. And lo and behold, because of the law of the Medes and the Persians, it cannot be redacted. It cannot be undone. It cannot be revoked. And Daniel was thrown, but survived the lion's den. Well, so it is, there's a decree sent out into all the land. Because of Vashti's rebellion, the king Xerxes says she will never, ever come before me again. We read this here in verse 17. The queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt, since they will say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. This very day, noble women of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's behavior will say the same thing to all the king's officials, and there'll be contempt and wrath in plenty. If it please the king, let a royal order go out from him. Let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes so that it may not be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before the king, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. So the decree was sent, was proclaimed and given in all the land, and this sets the scene for how one woman, one young orphan Jewish woman, saves the entire Jewish civilization. Because now the king is wifeless, and so he kind of sets up at this point a beauty contest. I know this sounds a bit soap opera to you, and it is a little bit, in fact. He kind of calls all the women in the land who've got any beauty to them, any grace, any talent, he calls them in, and they come one by one before him, and they show something that they can do. They show him their beauty, and then he will pick his new wife from that. But before they do, they have to go through one whole year of beautification. Husbands, don't complain how long it takes your wife to get ready in the morning. One whole year, they had to bathe in spices and oil so that they'd be aromatic. They had to be essentially painted from head to toe in this ancient makeup, and everything was done to beautify these women. And Mordecai calls upon Esther. Remember, he's his cousin, and we called her Hadassah, but she also has a Persian name. Her name is Hadassah. Her name is, Esther in Persian, and Mordecai encourages her to join the contest. So she goes and she prepares. She goes through the year-long ritual and prepares herself to stand before the king. And Esther is thereby, she is chosen. Chapter 2, verse 17, verse 18. Take a look at the summary of what happened here. The king loved Esther more than all the women. She won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. He also granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. Hadassah, who is now we will speak of as Esther, is called to be the king's new queen, his wife. And because of that, Mordecai begins to dwell right there in between the courts and the temple. He wants to look after his cousin who is adopted. He's raised her and prepared her, and he wants to be there. And while he's there, he overhears a plot to kill the king. Just overhears it. These two eunuchs who are kind of gatekeepers are speaking about how when the king comes through, we're going to get him and we're going to put an end to his life. And Mordecai hears this and he goes straight to Esther and says, warn the king. So Esther goes and she warns the king, your life is in great peril. There's a plot to kill and assassinate you. And she gave the report in Mordecai's name, that Mordecai's name would be spoken in the court and he would be given honor. We open up the next chapter and we find that there's now another man, a real antagonist who comes on the scene. His name is Haman. And Haman comes on the scene and we find out that Haman is an Agagite. Now I know the book says it several times, and every time you read it you think, oh, of course, I know what an Agagite is. I get it. But let me explain to you exactly why this is significant. Around about half a millennia earlier, there was a battle between Israel's first king. You remember the first king was Saul. And Saul engaged in battle with the Amalekites, and the king of the Amalekites was Agag. And Agag fought and lost, and Samuel the prophet had told Saul, destroy all of the Amalekites, their oxen, their lambs, their sheep, their produce, destroy them as a civilization and let no one alive, because if you do, they're going to plague you forever. And we know Saul rebels. Saul rebels because as Samuel comes into the camp where the Jews or the Hebrew army are assembled, Samuel walks up and he can hear the bleating of sheep. He can hear the mooing of cows, and he says, what's this I hear, Saul? And Saul says, I basically destroyed everything, but I kind of kept the best things. One of the things he kept was the king. The Amalekite king, Agag, was preserved. And when Samuel found out, he said to Saul, this day the kingdom is wrenched out of your hands and will be given to another. And Samuel himself takes a blade and slaughters the king. Well, true to prophecy, here in Esther, we now arrive at the moment when the Agagite will have his chance to have his vengeance on all of the Hebrew people. Haman, for whatever reason we're not told, is elevated in court to be a high-standing official before the king. And as Haman has marched around the palace and the city of Susa, everywhere he goes in royal regalia, everywhere he goes, people bow down and they give homage except one guy, Mordecai. Mordecai just stands and looks, doesn't care. Haman is furious, enraged, absolutely enraged. He's so enraged, he now sets a plot to absolutely, entirely annihilate all of the Hebrew people. All of them that are in the Persian Empire are going to be annihilated. And he starts to cast lots. He starts to throw dice to find out when would be the best time to enact the slaughter of all the Jewish people. The greatest Holocaust that could have ever existed against the Jews was about to take place because Mordecai knew in his heart that to bow down to Haman would be to bow down to Agag, and he refused to do so. Another interesting fact is that Mordecai's descendancy, where he comes from, is actually the same as Saul. He's also a descendant of Kish, a Benjaminite. So here it is right now in the book of Esther, what we saw half a millennia earlier in the book of Samuel, where we had Saul and the Amalekite king Agag, and they refused to obey, and Saul preserves him. And Samuel gives the prophecy that because you've failed, these people will be a curse to you. We now have Saul in Mordecai and Agag now in Haman, playing on the scene of the future of all of Israel's people right now in the book of Esther. These two descendants of these great kings, Saul and Agag, have now found their place on the stage to battle it out for the future of God's covenant people. Haman's furious, absolutely furious, incredibly enraged. So he starts to set a plot. How can we annihilate all the Jews? And he convinces Xerxes the king that it's a good idea because he promises Xerxes that he can fill all the coffers of the empire. All of the king's wealth and his fortune can be restored if only he annihilates all the Jews. Because it had been seen that the Jews were very successful. They're very wealthy people. They did business with honor and integrity, and people trusted them. And as business people, they were very much used and employed and given high-ranking positions, and the Jews became quite wealthy in Persia. In fact, one thing you may not have noticed when Ezra begins to talk about the returning exiles, one thing that's interesting is he talks about the Jews and their servants. Sometimes we have the wrong idea. Sometimes we have the idea that when all the Jews were swept away from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, they basically lived in chains, half naked, serving in the houses of great Babylonian princes. That was true for a time. Now under Persian rule, they were given significant freedom and they blossomed under the empire. They had servants. They had palatial dwellings. They were very successful. They had significant bank accounts. And Haman says to the king, all that wealth can be yours again. Just let me kill them all. Strangely enough, Xerxes agrees. Let's do it. I need money. I'm desperate. I'm being crushed by the Greeks over here. I need help. My empire is flailing and falling, and let's do it. Well, the dice is cast, the month is set, the edict of the king is written, and you remember, an edict of the king is irrevocable. That on a certain day, all the Jews throughout the kingdom can be freely and legally slaughtered, man, woman, and child. It's a devastating moment in the revelation of the story. Let's take a look, Esther 3, 12 to 13. I'll read it for you here. Esther chapter 3. This is the plot, Esther 3, verse 12 to 14. To destroy, to kill, to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women, children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. Now, there's a bit of conjecture here. It's a bit of conjecture because for some scholars and commentators, they believe that this is really talking about the immediate Persian Empire. But for a great deal of other scholars, they're saying every corner of the empire has now received this edict, and that also includes Jerusalem. Some 50,000 people returned to Jerusalem about 50, 60 years ago, rebuilt the temple, started to rebuild the city, and started to get a future and have children and repopulate the land that God gave to their forefathers. And now this edict threatens the very existence of every last Hebrew person. Esther knows none of this. She's not part of these discussions. She's not part of the war cabinet and the discussions about how to deal with ethnicities and go to war and the battles and all that. She's not part of any of this. And so Mordecai hears about it because an edict is sent out on paper, written, signed with the signet of the king that goes to all corners of the empire. And Mordecai grabs a copy of it. He reads it. He's overwhelmed. Clothes himself in sackcloth and he begins to wail, not weep and cry patiently and politely. He begins to screech and scream and holler and wail until finally word reaches Esther. Your cousin out there, he's a mess. Maybe go see him, see what's going on. She comes to speak to Mordecai and he reveals to her the plot that Haman is behind to crush and destroy the Jews. We take a look now at chapter 4. Mordecai summons Esther. Some have thought, well, okay, we've got someone in office. We've got someone right there in the king's palace. So this is going to be a pretty easy fix, right? But it's not going to be an easy fix. Because firstly, once the king signs a law, that's it. And secondly, the queen cannot just come and present herself before the king. She risks her life. Queens have died for walking in toward the king. If you've studied any ancient history, you know that one of the prominent ways that kings are assassinated is by their queens. Every king in the ancient world was petrified of assassination plot from their own queens. They didn't sleep in the same area. They didn't go in the same rooms. They were completely separate. And the queen only came before the king when she was officially summoned. And Esther hasn't been summoned in over 30 days. Let's take a look at Esther chapter 4. This is not going to be a quick fix. I'm going to read the whole chapter for us to build this up in the context. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, went out of the midst of the city, and he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. And in every province, wherever the king's command and his decree reached, there was mourning among the Jews, fasting and weeping and lamenting, and many of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's young women and her eunuchs came and told her, the queen was deeply distressed. She sent garments to clothe Mordecai so he might take off his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs who had been appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai and learn what this was and why it was. Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her and command her to go to the king to beg his favor and plead with him on behalf of her people. And Hathach went and told Esther what Mordecai had said. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say this: all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law: to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, I've not been called to come into the king these 30 days. They told Mordecai what Esther said, and Mordecai told them to reply to Esther: do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai: go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days' nights. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then went away and did everything that Esther had ordered him to do. Esther's in the most frightful place possible. The reality is Esther's probably going to die either way. That's Mordecai's point. That's the compelling leverage of Mordecai's argument. You might as well go and risk death by approaching the king uninvited, because if you don't, guess what, Esther? You're still a Jew. And when it's found out, she'd kept her Hebrew identity secret, but when it's found out, the edict cannot be repealed. You will be slaughtered like everybody else. So Esther decides she's going to approach the king. And so she does the monumental moment, perhaps the most engaging moment of the whole story. She comes to approach the court of the king. And she doesn't know, is he going to be particularly pleasant today? Is he going to accept me? He's already had one bad wife before who rebelled against him. Is he going to see me coming toward him and begin to freak out and assume a plot? He's already survived one assassination plot in recent times. Will he expect that I've come for harm? And the story goes, you've read Esther, the story goes that the king lowered the golden scepter, welcoming Esther into his presence and said to her, "What is it you want me to do for you? I will give you anything up to half of all my empire." So the first problem's resolved. The first problem of our challenge is resolved. The king is in fact pleasant toward Esther and welcomes her. So she begs the king to hold a feast in the honor of Haman. Hold a feast in the honor of Haman. Now, Haman is pumped by this because now, not only is Haman elevated and honored by the king Xerxes, now the queen seems to like him, but he doesn't really know what's going on. They have the feast. Haman comes in. He's dragged and he sits and eats with king and queen, this private little banqueting party, and he's so chuffed with his place that once he's finished the feast, he's had a lot to drink, a lot to eat, he's in the best mood of his life. He rides out of the banqueting place, the hall of the king, and there's Mordecai standing where he always stands. Everyone else bows before Haman, and Mordecai just crosses his arms. Bit of poetic license. The scripture doesn't say he crosses his arms, but I'm contextualizing it for you. Refuses to bow. Haman is now more enraged than ever before. Now Haman's a big deal, a bigger deal than he ever thought he could ever be. The king loves him. The queen loves him. He has private banquets with them. He thinks in his mind he has arrived at the most prominent place possible in the entire empire, unless you are actually the king. That night he goes home. He's full of glee and joy, but soon the festering rage at Mordecai consumes him. He starts to speak to his wife. He starts to speak to his servants in his house, and they say, "Look, let's build gallows. Let's build them now. Let's build them tonight. Tomorrow morning, you go before the king. You tell the king Mordecai needs to die, and we hang him on these gallows tomorrow." So the whole night, Haman superintends the building of these gigantic, exorbitant gallows. But God was working that night as well. Not only was Haman causing and seeking plans to destroy God's people, first starting with Mordecai, God was seeking the providential fix for the problem because the king couldn't sleep. He stirred with insomnia all night, and he says to his servants, his attendants, this is kind of strange, but again, the hand of God is in this. He says to his attendants, "Go and get me the book of the annals of the Persian kingdom and read them to me." It'd almost be like reading the phone book. The Persians recorded everything. That's why we know so much about the Persians. The archaeological discoveries and the evidence for all this stuff is overwhelming. And he says, "Go and get me the chronicles of the empire and read them to me. Hopefully that's adequate to put me to sleep." Well, as they're reading the chronicles to him, as they're reading the annals, all the minuted meetings in the war council, in everything that happened in the court was noted, dated, minuted, everything. And as it's being read, all of a sudden it's being read how Mordecai saved the king from the plot of the two eunuchs who guarded the gate. You remember we spoke about it just a moment ago. And King Xerxes shoots up and he says, "Wait a minute, has honor been bestowed on Mordecai for what he did? Has he been thanked? Has he been rewarded for his act?" The attendants say there's nothing recorded, and if there's nothing recorded, then nothing has happened. The king is immediately enthused. The next morning, he's sitting on his throne. Haman comes in to the throne room. And Haman, you remember, he's chuffed. He is peaked. He's reached the climax of his career. He sits down next to the king. The king says to Haman, "What do you think should be done to someone who the king wants to honor?" Well, Haman says, So he goes over the top. He says, "Bring out a garment that only the king's worn, put it on his shoulders, a royal garment. Bring out a crown, put it on his head. Bring out one of the royal horses that no one's ever rode on but the king." Can you see what Haman's doing? He's trying to give himself all the glory of the king of Persia. And he lists all, and let a whole procession be led for whoever this is. I don't know who we're talking about, king, but whoever this is, let a huge procession be led through the whole city, that everyone might hear the summons of the herald. Such is done to the one who the king wants to honor. The king says, that's great, Haman. Brilliant. Go right now. Go right away and get Mordecai and do it all for him. Haman has to lead the procession. That whole night he's spent officiating and orchestrating the gallows that he's going to kill Mordecai. Now he's walking through the city screaming out, such is done to the one that the king wants to honor. Such is done to the one that the king delights in. Mordecai is honored. Haman is further enraged. God is providentially working. The king says to Esther at the feast the day before, now what is it you want? We're having a banquet, we're doing our thing. Up to half my kingdom, just ask. And Esther says, give me another banquet tomorrow. I'll take another one tomorrow. I'll go ahead and have another banquet tomorrow in Haman's honor. So once the procession had finished, the eunuchs went and grabbed Haman and dragged him back to the palace for his second banquet. Surely this will cheer him up, right? Surely after a horrible evening, after a horrible overnight expense of trying to build this gallows that's now useless, and after an incredibly horrific morning shouting the praises of Mordecai, surely the afternoon feast will cheer him up. So he goes along, and Esther begins to speak of the plot against her people. The king is enraged. He says, who's behind this plot? At the feast, three of them sitting there, she says, Haman. Haman's behind the plot. This is 24 hours of entire destruction for Haman, who sought to destroy the people of God. Let's read chapter 7. Here it is, exactly what we've just spoke about. It's detailed for us right here. So the king and Haman went in to feast with Queen Esther. On the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king said to Esther, what is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled. Then Esther the queen answered, if I found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. And if we'd been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. Then Xerxes said to Queen Esther, who is he and where is he who dared to do this? And Esther said, a foe, an enemy, this wicked Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. Verse 7, and the king rose in his wrath from drinking wine and went into his palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. You think, Haman? This reminds me of when I was preparing, I said I wouldn't tell this story, but I can't help but tell this story. It reminds me of an incredible moment in the biography of Adoniram Judson. You know, I talk about him quite a bit. The first American missionary, went to Burma. And the trials he endured at the hand of the Burmese. It wasn't legal to preach the gospel. There was no empire-wide edict. The preaching was allowed in the 1800s in Burma. And there's Adoniram Judson. And he's thrown in prison because the English from India invade Burma. The English army invade Burma. And the Burmese in this day and age had never really suffered military defeat. They'd conquered and beaten everybody, and they assumed that they would quickly defeat the English, and they would quickly defeat India, and then they would conquer the whole world. It's literally written in the Burmese annals. Say, we'll conquer the world, we'll end up at England, and we'll take their land off them. Well, the English army sent a few hundred troops and crushed the entire empire. And the missionaries that were there in Burma at the time were immediately arrested as spies and thrown into a prison that is named Hand Fail Not, a prison that is world-renowned for the most grievous tortures and horrific treatment that could ever be imagined. And the whole time, Adoniram Judson's wife is pleading for clemency. He's not a spy. He's a missionary. He's a teacher. He's come to educate you people about how to receive eternal life. He's not what you think. He's not even English. He's an American. It's a completely different nationality. But the Burmese were that suspicious. They were that amazed that their armies were so quickly conquered, they assumed that every single white person in the country was a spy. Many of the people in the prison died. Adoniram Judson lived, and every day his wife Anne, who actually bore a child during the whole ordeal, she spent every day of her life going to the court and begging for mercy. And this one day when she essentially, I don't want to give the story away, but she kills herself in the whole thing. She loses, and then the baby dies. Little Maria dies soon after. The whole thing is an incredibly dark moment in the life. But there's this one moment in the story where Anne Judson is appealing and begging for help and mercy. Is not what you think he is. And once she knew she couldn't get any freedom, she began to beg that at least he would be allowed clothes, and at least he'd be allowed food, and at least he'd be allowed some basic sanitary comfort, and it was all denied. This one day she goes to this one general's house, this prominent political leader's house, and she walks many, many miles in the blazing Southeast Asian sun. And all she's got is a little baby in her arms and an umbrella over her head. She walks the journey. She gets to the politician's house. She begins to beg him, and he rebuffs her with such cruelty, she was completely thrown back. And then he said to her, "I like your umbrella." And while she's there begging for a husband and treated harshly by this politician, he steals her umbrella and makes her walk all the way back, almost to her death from sunstroke that day. Well, long story short, the English won, conquered. And the English called, once they had marched on Burma and destroyed all the resolve of the Burmese, they called all the political leaders to a banquet. And there at the banquet that day sat Anne and Adoniram Judson. And across the table was this Burmese politician, surrounded by dozens of high-ranking English generals and troops and soldiers. And Anne began to tell the story. And this little guy began to hear his name. And as he began to hear his name, he could see the men, the military hardened men, the battle-wearied men of the English standing there. They started to bristle and stare at him, and they were ready to cut his throat with a bayonet then and there. And Anne turns to this politician and she says in Burmese, "Stay. It's fine. Your life is not in danger now." And now when I go to this moment at this banquet, I can't help but think about that moment when Haman had done everything he could to destroy the Jews in the empire. But what he hadn't factored in was that the God of the Jews is the one true God. And the God of the Jews had planted in the kingdom. The very queen of the empire was in fact a Hebrew woman. And he and no one had any idea. He starts to beg, he starts to scream, Haman starts to cry out, "Mercy, mercy, mercy." But of course, Haman will be shown as much mercy as he showed the Jews. Verse 8, and the king returned from the palace garden to the place where they were drinking wine as Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. And so the king walks in and Haman is screaming and crying and wailing, and he throws himself onto the couch where Esther was sitting just as the king walks in. He says, "I see how it is. You try and kill the Jews, now you're trying to rape my wife." It's going really bad for Haman. Really, really bad. And so we see the king is even more enraged. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs and the attendants of the king, said, "Moreover, the gallows," so now the eunuch pipes up, "moreover, Haman has built gallows to kill Mordecai, who saved the king." That's Haman's bad luck. This guy chimed in at that moment. 50 cubits high. The king said, "Hang him on that." So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he'd prepared for Mordecai. Then the wrath of the king abated. But we still have a problem in Persia. The edict is issued, signed with the signet of the king. We still have a problem in Persia. What are we going to do with this slaughter? The king then says to Esther and Mordecai and the attendants, "You guys can write a law as best as you know that might counteract the law that was originally written." So they wrote the law that would say every single Jew in the empire had the king's permission to defend themselves with whatever means they liked. Well, the day came. And the Persians, not all the Persians, but the ones of the empire who received the original edict with great joy, thinking, "Oh, I'm going to get his house, and I'm going to get his car, and I'm going to get his plasma TV, I'm going to get his laptop and his smart, I'm going to get all this stuff." And these greedy bandits started to congregate, and they began to attack the Jews, but they were quickly destroyed and slaughtered and conquered. The Jews won the great victory that day, and the Jews began to celebrate a festival, a feast of the Purim, in honor of God's preservation of them at the darkest hour when it looked like their life would be entirely snuffed out. And this would do something else as well. This would remind all those Jews had become comfortable, who'd kind of eased into lax in the Persian Empire, said, life's great here. I got an instinct in my heart that God probably wants me to return to Israel and help build the temple and help build Jerusalem, but I'm kind of busy over here with business and family, and kids are about to graduate, and I just got to finish off this particular business deal. I've got to travel. I'm definitely going back one day. I'm just not sure when it is. Now all the Jews in the empire became aware that their life is short under Persian rule, and they all ought to return to the place that God had granted them. Esther saves the day by the power of God. All the Jewish people established the feast of Purim. And so we see this, it's an incredible story of how God used one orphan girl to conquer the Persian attacks upon the Jews and preserve the life of God's covenant people. So what practical advice does this particular story have for us? It's a great story. It's been made into novels and films. I don't know, dozens of novels and films and articles and stories. And plenty of people have seen this story. It's a great story of intrigue and a great story of secrecy and clandestine operation and murder and genocide and preservation. It's a great story. It's a story from rags to riches as Hadassah, the little impoverished orphan girl, is adopted by Mordecai, and because of the beauty that God gave her, she now rules the Persian Empire. It is a great story, but what can it teach us? I've got a few points here I'd like to just highlight before we close out our discussion on our overview of the book of Esther. Firstly, and probably the most prominent message of the book of Esther for you and I, is to remember that where God has uniquely placed you, where God has uniquely called you. The great mistake sometimes we make is when we read these stories, we think, well, if only God had put me in the palace, I would have done all that for sure. No different to Esther. I'd have done the same thing. It's not a big deal. I'm that kind of person. I've got the character, the integrity. I would have done that. But then the question must be, but what are you doing now where God has put you? I mean, where God's actually put you, not some ethereal, abstract idea where your imagination can take you, but right now where God has you, are you speaking for Him? Are you acting for Him? Are you living for Him right now where He has in fact put you? It's no good. It's no good to speculate. If only I became the king of an empire, if only I became the queen, if only I became someone extremely significant, then I'd live for God. What are you doing now? Where you are right now is providentially orchestrated by a sovereign God. What are you doing now? What is true of Esther is true for us, that God has called us to the kingdom for such a time as this. Not to be inactive, not to be complacent or apathetic, not to do nothing, but to speak for God, to represent God, to proclaim His goodness wherever we might be. The next application point, the reminder we have from the book of Esther, is that big doors of destiny seem to always swing on very small hinges. There's moments in this story, and even predating this story, where the entire future hangs in the balance. What about Saul with the king of the Amalekites? Why didn't he destroy? Why didn't he obey? Why didn't he do what God called him to do? This whole thing wouldn't even be an issue today if there was no Haman. But in this day it was an issue because Saul rebelled. Half a millennia later on the scene we have, and we see big moments of deep fate and destiny swinging on very small hinges. Remember this. This is the point. This is the point. That when we feel like it's not a big moment, when we feel like it's not a significant moment, when we feel like it's not a prominent moment, how easy is it for us to lose our resolve for holiness and integrity? Most people think to themselves that, well, in those big matters when it counts, I'm sure that if I was somewhere and all of a sudden ISIS showed up with a large blade over my head and said, reject Christ or die, I'm confident I'd say, Jesus is Lord, take off my head, I'm going to see Him face to face. That's all well and good. But again, what about in those smaller moments? What about in those seemingly less significant moments? What about obedience in those moments when it looks like no one's watching, no one will know, no one will care? What about those moments? Time and time and time again in the narrative of Esther, we meet with these moments where it seems the smallest insignificant thing hangs the entire destiny of a civilization. Why wouldn't Mordecai just bow the first day he saw Haman? What was his conviction so strong about that he would not bow to the Amalekite king? Why was he so firm on that? And because of that, the entire nation was wiped out, almost, except for a sequence of other small moments. Are you, not all about the grand idea of the great big moments in your life, are you just as resolved to live for God in the small, seemingly insignificant moments? Great doors of destiny swing on very small hinges in God's glorious plan. The last point, I only picked out 3. There are dozens, of course, in the book of Esther. But the last one we should always remember is that we ought always to expect God's intervention. We ought always to expect God to act on our behalf if we've prayed in faith and we trust Him to do so. The greatest moment in the book of Esther isn't necessarily Esther approaching the king, risking her life. It's not necessarily Esther orchestrating the 2 great feasts so that she can call out Haman. No, it's God giving the king a night of insomnia. That's what it was. Without that one night of insomnia, none of this story would have happened. God robbed the king of sleep so that the Jews could be saved. Always expect God to intervene on your behalf in ways that He wants to, in ways that He knows is best. How quick are we to make plans and offer them to God and say, okay, I want you to step in here. This is how I'd like you to do it. The way I see it, this is the best way for this thing to play out, God. So if you could, just come on in at this moment when I've got you orchestrated and scheduled to arrive. If we've prayed, we've trusted, we've given ourselves over to God, given our family, our career, our life, our ministry, our gifts, if we've given them to God, then we expect always for Him to intervene on our behalf in His time and in His way. There's 3 practical points I'd like to offer you tonight from Esther, and we'll close out with a reminding of the gospel. I don't know about you, but I can't read Esther without being reminded of Jesus Christ. I can't read Esther without being reminded of Jesus Christ. Esther, with all the courage in the world, approached the king and he lowered the scepter. He lowered the scepter to welcome her in and say, you have been granted the favor of the kingdom of Persia. But I can't read that without being reminded of my Lord who approached His king for me twice. The Bible tells us that Jesus Christ, who is God incarnate, God in our flesh, in our form, fully human, fully God. And that Jesus Christ, though He had no sin of His own, though He'd never sinned Himself, He was completely impeccable as the definition of the word of holy. Jesus was holy. Yet He approached the king. We are told that on the cross, He came before His Father and gave His life as a ransom for many. The first time Jesus approached the king, it wasn't a lowered golden scepter, it was a splintered wooden Roman cross. As He was destroyed for my sins, for our failure, for our rebellion, Jesus was crucified on our behalf. He went before a greater king, a king that makes Xerxes look like a minor pawn in God's hands. Jesus went before the greater monarch for you and I, because we are sinners. Because the reality is, if we approach God, if we live this life our way, and then when we die, we go and stand before God, and we don't have Jesus, the scepter's not going to be lowered. The Bible is clear that all that come before the holy, just, almighty God, without an atonement, without forgiveness, without substitution, all who chance their arm in doing that, everyone will be destroyed in eternal condemnation. But Jesus went, He went for us. Esther goes before Xerxes, and it's a grand moment, but when Jesus goes before the King of all kings, the omnipotent of the universe, it's then that we realize here is the great fulfillment of Esther's example. Jesus goes once to the cross, dies on behalf of sin, pays the penalty that you and I deserve to pay, and He is buried in a tomb. And the Bible says that death could not hold Him. But death had no victory over Christ, but He rose in glorious triumph over sin and death for all who believe. And the Bible tells us Jesus went back. He went back to approach the same monarch, the great almighty King of the universe, God Himself. Jesus went back. The first time He went before His God as a lamb to be slaughtered, and the second time He went as one who was prepared to offer His sacrifice to atone for our sins.